Hello and good day. I am so delighted to be able to share with you some of my latest findings and research about hormones that come from our intestines or our gut. In particular, we will talk about a hormone called GLP-1 and some others, and you're going to learn how well positioned you are to help people not only learn more about these hormones, but also take advantage of them to improve their health. I am Professor Ben Bickman, and I have been asked to teach this on behalf of Unicity and the Science Advisory Board. As we get started, I want to just remind you of the metabolic problem that we have worldwide. That worldwide, roughly half of all of the adults are overweight. They have too much fat tissue. But also, over half of all adults worldwide have a problem called insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is very important because it increases the risk of so many chronic diseases like diabetes and heart disease and many, many more. Now, we are getting fatter around the world and insulin resistance is going up around the world. So naturally, we're curious about what is the connection? What is it about getting fatter that is increasing the likelihood of having insulin resistance? In order to answer that, you need to know that humans can get fat through two different ways. We can get fatter, so we can actually have more fat on our bodies, either through a process called hypertrophy, which is when the fat cells get bigger and bigger, or through a process called hyperplasia, which is when the fat cells all stay quite small, but they multiply and become much more abundant. Hypertrophy is how most people get fat, and unfortunately, it leads to problems. First, it makes fat cells actually insulin resistant, because by becoming insulin resistant, the fat cell can stop growing. It's already getting so big that it becomes insulin resistant to slow down its growth. At the same time, the fat cell starts to suffocate. By getting so big, it actually makes it harder for the fat cell to get enough oxygen from blood vessels. And a response is that the fat cell begins leaking out a lot of very pro-inflammatory molecules, which starts to promote inflammation throughout the body. And these two things, the insulin resistance and the inflammation, both start to make insulin resistance much worse throughout the body. Now, if the growth of the fat cell through hypertrophy is the problem at contributing to insulin resistance, then the solution must be that we need to simply shrink our fat cells. And if we can shrink our fat cells, then we can reduce insulin resistance. But that begs the question, how then do we shrink our fat cells? Well, there are two variables to keep in mind. One, lowering insulin, and the other, lowering calories. Now, unfortunately, most people get this wrong. And let me explain. If you have a person who has, maybe this is someone you know or care about, this is a friend or a family member, and they are overweight, they have too much body fat, you could tell them that their body fat levels are creating a health problem for them. And they may already know that. And so you say you need to shrink your fat cells. Well, most commonly, people will start on this fat cell shrinking journey by eating less calories. And they might not even care what insulin levels are doing. They might not even know about lowering insulin. All they think about is lowering calories. The problem with that is this strategy makes them very hungry. And if they start off on this journey to shrink their fat cells and they're very hungry, hunger will win and they won't get very far. And before you know it, they're right back where they started. Now, to explain this, let me use an example. Let's imagine that we have all been invited to a delicious dinner. And that as a part of this dinner, there are going to be the world's best chefs, and they are going to be creating some of the most delicious foods you could imagine. And as we are invited to this event, we are told that we should come hungry. because there's going to be so much good food that we want to eat a little bit of everything. Well, what would we do? What two things would we do to make sure we came to this dinner as hungry as possible? I bet the two things that you are thinking of, if you were to make sure that you were as hungry as possible, you would eat a little less before you went to the event, and you would exercise a little more. And sure enough, you would be very hungry. But can you see the problem with this? This is what we have been telling people to do for decades, for 60 years or more. We have been telling people that are overweight or that have too much fat tissue, we've been saying, you need to eat less and exercise more. And that's going to be the key to you, to your being able to lose weight. But what happens, of course, is that all that really does is make it so that they become very, very hungry. Now, what happens if we could imagine a situation where a person is overweight, they have high levels of insulin, but they start restricting their calories without lowering their insulin? If insulin stays high, it's going to start pushing any calories into the person's fat tissue. And by pushing all of the energy into the fat tissue, other tissues, like the brain, start to go hungry because they don't get the energy. So again, if we're eating less energy, but insulin is high, insulin's going to be pushing all of that energy into fat cells. And so it makes the brain not get enough energy. And the brain starts to go hungry, and that starts to tell the body to be hungry. So if we come back to this fat cell shrinking journey, and we say, rather than start this journey by lowering calories, which is just going to promote hunger, let's start the journey by lowering insulin. And we'll let the calories take care of themselves. If we lower our insulin first, we have a number of advantages or a number of changes that will happen in our body that leaves us in a better position to continue to lose weight. For example, we could have an increased metabolic rate. We're actually burning more energy because insulin is low. We will also begin using our own fat for fuel. So think about people who go to the gym and they're going to exercise at the gym. And during their exercise, they're nibbling on a little energy bar, or they're drinking an energy drink or a sports drink. You shouldn't need energy while you're exercising at the gym. You want to be using your own energy. Namely, you want to be burning your own fat for fuel. And that can happen when insulin is down. So when insulin is down, the body will begin burning its own fat, which helps you shrink your fat cells. Similarly, when you're burning a lot of fat, you begin making these other things called ketones. And ketones are really good because they can fuel the brain. And when ketones are higher in the blood, they tell the brain that you don't need to eat as much. It helps promote a sense of what's called satiety. And this is when hunger starts to be reduced. And this means calories start to be controlled on their own. You naturally begin eating less. If the fat cell shrinking journey starts with lowering insulin, we start to eat less and less and less, and calories will just take care of itself. Okay, so we have to shrink our fat cells to improve our insulin sensitivity. And we can do that by really focusing on lowering insulin and eating a little less frequently. And with that in mind, I just want to remind you of two principles that you've heard me talk about before. The most effective way to reduce insulin is to control carbohydrates. Focus on fiber and eat less and less of other carbohydrates that come in bags and boxes with barcodes. Those are always going to be highly refined carbohydrates that are going to spike your glucose and your insulin levels very high. And then number two, after you've done number one, is to frequently fast, because in so doing, it helps your insulin come down and it helps you control your calories. But fasting can be hard because it can make you a little hungry. So what is the best way to reduce hunger, to make it so that fasting is a little easier? Last time I spoke to you, I introduced to you 3 different molecules. And these 3 molecules all have one thing in common, which is that they can reduce hunger. Theobromine reduces hunger, ketones reduce hunger, and short-chain fats, small little fats do too. And I mentioned to you at the time that there is a good way for you to help increase these molecules in your blood. Unimate can increase theobromine and ketones, and balance can increase the amount of short-chain fats. So you are in a good place to be able to help people have more theobromine, more ketones, and more short-chain fats. Now, let's get into the real purpose of this talk, which is to talk about the intestines or the guts. Now, as I do this, let me introduce to you a new word I bet that you've never heard before, which is incretin. Incretin. The incretin hormones are hormones that come from the gut. So your intestines are actually releasing these hormones into the blood. And one of the things they all have in common is that they help your blood glucose levels come down. And by having blood glucose levels come down, insulin comes down as well. Now, we first learned about the incretins because of gastric bypass, so surgeries that change the stomach. And they take the big stomach and they turn it into a small little stomach. And then this small little stomach means so you can't eat a lot of food. And so the person is often very hungry. They're just eating a lot less. But scientists found that after someone had had gastric bypass levels, that when they looked at their insulin resistance, which is what they're measuring here, their insulin resistance got very good very quickly. So they became very insulin sensitive very quickly after their bypass surgery. And so the clinical team wondered, and the scientists, they wondered, why did the insulin resistance improve so quickly? What happened? How do we explain it? And they found that part of this effect was because of a big increase in hormones called incretins that were coming from the gut. And the incretins, there are a lot of them. And I just want to highlight 3. GLP-1, which is the most famous, and we're going to talk a lot about it, and then 2 others, PYY and CCK. And just to show you what happens, when you look at GLP-1 levels in the blood after someone has had gastric bypass surgery, it is way higher, about 10 times higher after they've eaten a meal compared to before they had the surgery done. So you can see that there really is a substantial increase in GLP-1 levels. And in fact, this is what has been taken advantage of with certain drugs called Ozempic and Wegovy. And I bet you've heard of these drugs, even though the names may be a little different. They mostly work by acting at the liver. In particular, the drug that is called Ozempic lowers glucagon levels, the hormone glucagon. And glucagon's job is to increase blood glucose. It wants to push blood glucose up. So glucagon is a hormone that goes to the liver and pushes blood glucose up. But GLP-1 is inhibiting glucagon. So if you inhibit glucagon, guess what happens to blood glucose levels? They go down. Now, another effect happens from GLP-1, which is that it slows down the stomach, the intestines. Normally, your intestines are contracting and moving food along. And so food, you may eat food and it will stay in your stomach and get pushed around and chewed up for about 3 or 4 hours. However, GLP-1 slows that down, so the food will be there much longer. And so hunger is down. If food is staying in your stomach for longer, then you're just less hungry. And this really happens much more with a drug called Wegovy. Wegovy really slows down the stomach. And it's no surprise that these drugs can help with weight loss. And in fact, this has become very big business. It's very big for weight loss now. And that is because of the paralysis or the slowing down of the intestines, but sometimes it slows down too much and the stomach can become paralyzed. And so the food stops moving. This is something that has been published. We know that this can happen in some people, and that can become very, very lethal. The person can have, they can become very, very sick because of it. And also what happens is that people start to lose muscle mass. This paper here found that almost half of all of the weight that people were losing was coming from their lean mass. So, I mean, that is such a problem. So half of all of the fat that they were losing was coming from their lean mass. So a pretty big problem, right? Where they want to lose fat, but now they're losing fat and muscle. And bone too, that's part of the lean mass. So that was the lean mass effect. Now, what's interesting is that some people, what we see start happening more and more is that people are wanting to stop taking these drugs. It makes their stomach upset, they feel kind of sick, and they don't like losing their muscle and their bone mass. And as people stop taking the drugs, it's no surprise that when they're on the drug, they're eating so little that they lose a lot of weight. But then the moment they stop, they of course gain their weight back. Now, this study stopped looking, but naturally it's no surprise that they continue to gain weight back. But look at this gap here. What would this gap be made up of? Remember, they've lost 40% of what they lost with their weight was coming from their muscle and bone. They don't gain that weight back. They gain all of their fat mass back, but they do not gain their lean mass back. So as a percent of their total weight, even though they weigh a little less here than they did here, they're actually fatter. They have more fat. They have a higher percent body fat because of this. So you may be wondering, or your friends may be wondering, how can you get some of the benefits of the incretins without the negative side effects that we've been talking about? Then they feel really sick or they are losing muscle mass. Well, one way possibly is through Unimate. And let me explain why. Unimate has been designed to be enriched or to have high levels of various molecules and compounds like chlorogenic acids, EGCG, and one that you've probably never heard of called ferulic acid. And these molecules that are higher in Unimate that get into your blood, as they are moving through the body, they actually stimulate the intestines to release these incretins. I want to spend a few minutes so that you are familiar with them, so that this is something you can go and teach and talk about with someone else. Let's start with CCK. CCK is called cholecystokinin. Cholecystokinin. It has many effects, including it will increase a hormone called somatostatin. And somatostatin can help because it lowers insulin, which helps fat cells shrink and become more insulin sensitive, and it lowers glucagon, which can help glucose levels come down. Also, CCK will help the gallbladder to fully release all of the bile. And we're going to come back to that and why that's important in just a moment. CCK also slows down the stomach a little, which is nice because then it helps a person feel fuller for longer. They don't get as hungry. And then lastly, and this one's maybe the most interesting, is that CCK increases the activity of brown fat tissue. And we're going to talk more about brown fat tissue in just one moment. But before we do, let me just show you an interesting connection between the gallbladder and brown adipose tissue. So the gallbladder, when it contracts, it releases bile into the intestines to help digest food, especially fat. And some of that bile will get reabsorbed. It will be pulled back into the blood, and that will turn into blood or plasma bile acids. And these are interesting because they will go to the brown fat and turn it on. It will make the brown fat be much, much more active. Now, you're thinking, what is brown fat that Dr. Bickman keeps talking about? Well, the body has two different types of fat. We have white fat, which is very big fat cells with a very low metabolic rate. Then we have brown fat cells, which are very small and they're very hyper. They have a very high metabolic rate. And they look very, very different. They have a load of mitochondria, especially. And you may remember learning about the mitochondria. The mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. It's the part of the cell that is burning fat and burning glucose to just make energy. And so this is something that there's a lot of in the brown adipose tissue. And that means the brown adipose tissue can burn fat very, very well. And here, when we look at white fat compared to brown fat, they're very different in how not only they look, but also how they act. Brown fat wants to be burned. It wants to use fat for fuel to create heat. White fat does not want to be burned. It has a very low metabolic rate. It just wants to store energy, and it wants to be left alone. It's a very quiet, low metabolic rate tissue. It doesn't really want to do much. Unfortunately for us, that's what we have the most of as adult humans. Most of the fat we have on our bodies is white fat. But when we are babies, we have a little more brown fat to help us stay warm as a newborn baby. Then as we grow, we get less and less of it. However, as this study shows, we do have brown fat, and it's located throughout this part of our chest in small little areas. And when we have more brown fat, it actually protects us against gaining fat. So it helps us stay lean and it helps us stay insulin sensitive. That's what this study found, that people with more brown adipose tissue, or the brown adipose tissue was more active, they had better overall metabolic health. So that's the effect of CCK on brown adipose tissue. It turns it on, and now you know why that's a good thing. Now with peptide YY, PYY, I'm not going to talk too much about it. I just want you to know that this is a marker in the blood of people who have good or bad metabolic health. That if people have low PYY, it suggests that it's more likely that they're going to become fatter, that they're going to gain fat going forward. PYY is helpful at staying lean and metabolically healthy. And that's because of what it does. Once again, PYY acts by slowing down the stomach. So it makes us feel fuller for longer and we get less hungry. In addition, it actually acts right directly on the brain and tells the brain directly to eat less. And it acts directly on white fat, telling the white fat that it's time to be burned for energy, which helps us, of course, shrink our fat cells and be more metabolically healthy. And now let's talk a little bit about GLP-1. GLP-1 is the most famous of all of the incretins, and for good reason, because GLP-1 kind of has the best of everything, where GLP-1 increases, it slows down the stomach, so to make us feel fuller for longer, to reduce hunger. It also acts directly at the brain, telling the brain that we're not hungry. It activates brown adipose tissue, making this metabolic rate turn on. And it helps the white fat to be burned more, so that the body is burning more fat to help the fat cells shrink. Now, why do I talk about these? Let's just focus a little bit on GLP-1 and Unimate, so that this is something you can talk about with your friends. And as I do so, I want to share with you a paper that my lab published just last year, looking at yerba mate in the form of Unimate and how it affected the energy and the metabolism and the oxidative stress. First, I want to share with you that we found that Unimate increased GLP-1 almost double, by about 60 to 70%. So a pretty substantial increase in GLP-1 levels in the animals that were being fed in the group that was getting the Unimate. And then also in the Unimate group, we looked at the metabolism of 3 different tissues: fat tissue, muscle tissue, and liver tissue. And we found, and this is very, very cool, this is very neat, that the Unimate group had fat tissue. This looks like it's bad because it goes down, but it's actually a good thing. This fat tissue was burning more energy, and it was just burning more energy for no reason. That means that the white fat was behaving more like brown fat, which is very, very cool. There's very, very few things that are capable of doing this. So this means that the fat was being burned more. However, at the muscle, we found that in the Unimate group, the muscle was being more efficient. It was burning less, which is not a bad thing. That means that the muscle only burns what it needs, so it was more efficient, which suggests that the body would be capable of better exercise. And then lastly, at the liver, we found, it was this bottom one here that I wanted to share with you because it's so interesting. We found that in the liver became better at removing oxidative stress. So dealing with oxidative stress, it was helping it kind of clean out the oxidative stress from the body much more effectively. Now, up until this point, I have really just been focusing on Unimate, and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but Dr. Bickman, with the Feel-Great system, we have something else we can talk about, namely balance. And I want to share a couple things with you about balance. The first one is a study that we did with Unicity, an in-house study. And normally, we've always said that you should take balance 15 minutes before the meal. And that's what this blue line showed with regards to the glucose difference. But we also tested what happens if you take balance with the meal at the same time, like either right before you're eating or even during the eating. And you can see that it lowered the glucose level substantially throughout this entire time. It was a substantial reduction in glucose levels by taking the balance at the same time as eating. Now, let's bring this back from my last point to GLP-1, because even balance has an effect. This study that I have citing right here, here's the citation number. They found, in conclusion, our study highlights the importance of dietary fiber to maintain, like the fiber you get from balance, L cell secretion and intestinal integrity. Now, there's a lot here, but the L cells are the cells that make GLP-1. And so the fiber from balance is helping the L cells work better and release more GLP-1 into the body to get all of the benefits of the GLP-1, the brown adipose tissue activation, the white fat burning, the satiety centers turning on in the brain, and the intestines slowing down a little to help us feel fuller for longer. And then the last point here, the intestinal integrity, that actually suggests that balance can also help with things like leaky gut. Now, thank you all for listening. If there is a way, if you have questions, I love answering questions. So if you can get the questions through your distributors and then through the Unicity team to me, I would be happy to answer questions and get those answers back to you. Thank you, all of you, for listening and for being such good students. I hope you have taken some notes and that you have learned some new things that you can go and teach these new ideas to your friends. Thank you.